This is the Unique Scotland podcast with exclusive ScottishVisits.co.uk.
Hello, this is John Harbour, and welcome to Unique Scotland, the go-to podcast on all things Scottish. And I'm delighted to have you with me on this part of our journey around Scotland, especially as we're going to be at Edinburgh Castle. Today, I'm broadcasting this from my study in Aberlady, a small village about 20 minutes east of Edinburgh. For April, it's very wet and windy, and on my walks with Minnie, I'm noticing the farmers' fields are totally sodden, so not surprising that the latest newspaper headlines are suggesting that food prices might rise due to poor crops. Well, we'll see. At least it's mild, and the temperatures are creeping up to about 12 degrees centigrade, around 56 degrees Fahrenheit. This podcast is the third in a four-part series on Edinburgh City, the capital of Scotland. In this series, I've already covered the Old Town and the New Town, and today I'll be taking on a tour with me into Edinburgh Castle, the massive fortification sitting atop an extinct volcano. In this podcast, you'll travel way back in time to the first fortification built around 4,000 years ago. I'll be explaining why a fortification was built on this extinct volcano and why it's remained a fortress to this day. And you'll also hear how it all began, and then fast forward, you'll hear about the part the castle played in the Wars of Independence, as well as the Jacobite Rebellion, resulting in the building of the Argyll battery of guns to defend against these supporters of James VII. And what about the 1 o'clock gun? Why is it fired every day to shake Edinburgh to its roots? And we'll also look inside the military prison and who the inmates were. All this before we arrive at Crown Square with the Royal Palace, now housing the Crown Jewels of Scotland, or using the correct title, the Honours of Scotland. And I'm also going to be telling you about the oldest building in Edinburgh and how it survived the ravages of time from Robert the Bruce in the 14th century up until the modern day. And who's the Grey Lady Ghost who enjoys frightening tourists from time to time? And I'm also delighted to have with me today for a short interview Lieutenant Colonel David Jack, the Royal Scots Regimental Secretary, who's going to tell us about the association of the regiment with the castle. This and so much more to come. So, I think it's time to get the tour of Edinburgh Castle underway, and as always, it's great to share Scotland with you. Perhaps this podcast will whet your appetite to come and visit this fine country for yourselves, and if you do, you will certainly be stopping in our capital city for a night or two, so Edinburgh Castle should certainly be on your list. If for whatever reason you can't come in person, then let me bring Scotland to you. To see some great photos of this castle tour, have a look at my website, exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk, or my Facebook page or Instagram, and if you listen through my website, please don't forget to email subscribe to ensure that you get notification of future episodes. And next month I'll be putting up a YouTube video of the castle as I discuss the Stone of Destiny, so subscribe to my YouTube channel, Exclusive Scottish Visits, to get notification of that. Well, wherever you are in the world, I would now like you to relax and be transported to Scotland on this third part of our Unique Scotland journey around Edinburgh, and a wonderful visit to the mighty Edinburgh Castle. It was a bright and breezy day at the top of Edinburgh Castle, and the tourist crowds were queuing up in Crown Square at the entry to the 15th century Royal Palace, in which the Scottish Crown Jewels, or the Honours of Scotland, are on display. Suddenly there was a high-pitched scream, and people began pouring out of the exit in a panicked stampede to get away from the building as fast as they could. The castle guards tried to calm the situation, but these individuals were determined to put some distance between them and the Royal Palace. One of the running throng was heard to shout that a grey ghost-like figure of a woman had been seen, but would not stop to elaborate further. After the furore of this outburst had subsided, everything seemed to return to normal, and visitors who had not been privy to any potential ghosts continued their tour. Now, not much has been written about this incident, but I believe that it was probably the sighting of the Grey Lady Ghost of Glamis, who was burned at the stake on 17th of July 1537 at Castle Hill, around 500 metres from the castle gate. Now, this was a true story of a Lady Janet Douglas, who was married to John Lyon, and he was Lord Glamis of Glamis Castle. He died in 1528, and she was accused of poisoning him. But she was cleared of the crime and married a second time to a chap called Archibald Campbell of Skipness. Now, a few years later, she was implicated in a plot to poison King James V of Scotland, but with little evidence to go on, she was then accused and convicted of witchcraft, which was an easy way to get rid of any woman in 16th century Scotland. And she was sent to Edinburgh Castle dungeon just under Crown Square, and she remained there for a few days. On the day of her execution, she was taken down Castle Hill to the bottom of the present-day Esplanade, where she was then half-strangled and burned at the stake. Her ghost is believed to roam around Edinburgh Castle and Glamis Castle to this day. Now, was this the Grey Lady that the terrified tourist was referring to as he made his escape from the palace at the top of the castle? We will never know. Edinburgh Castle, which has suffered over 20 sieges, is a testament to some incredible architectural engineering from the 12th to the 19th centuries, with amazing tales of battles and sieges where the castle has witnessed the most explosive part of Scotland's history and the making of a nation. A book on the castellated and domestic architecture of Scotland from the 12th to the 18th century was recorded by David McGibbon and Thomas Ross. They included 769 stone castles in Scotland, but if you search the National Monuments Records of Scotland, then you'll find thousands of recorded fortifications, from fortified houses, towers for protection of minor nobility, to the magnificent royal castles that remain in Scotland today. And the most magnificent of them all is Edinburgh Castle. Before we take a walk inside, a wee bit of history. Edinburgh Castle's great popularity with previous clan chiefs and royalty was its near impregnability. With its south, west and northern sheer rock faces climbing to a height of 250 feet, it was nigh impossible to take the castle from these sides. The eastern approach was therefore heavily defended as the only feasible access point to the castle, and as it happens, there was certainly one heroic scaling of the rock face to take the castle during the Wars of Independence in the 14th century, but more of that later. I actually want to start around 340 million years ago, when extraordinary volcanic activity formed the landscape you see in the centre of Edinburgh today, with only the volcanic plugs on view and sitting above the surrounding softer sandstone. The Arthur Seat volcano, as it's known, has three parts: Arthur Seat, Calton Hill and Castle Rock, upon which Edinburgh Castle was built. But before it was built, we have to come forward now to 2 million years ago, when huge glaciers, perhaps a mile high, came over from the west coast mountains and scoured the ground, gouging almost everything in their path. When the glaciers met the extremely hard dolerite or basalt rock of the volcanic plugs, it couldn't move it, so it had to go round. So the softer stone to the east of the plug was protected, leaving the natural crag and tail structure we see today. The last ice age ended around 10,000 years ago, and hunter-gatherers would have eventually travelled up from Europe to the northern part of what we now call Britain. We know that the top of the castle crag was used perhaps 4,000 or 5,000 years ago as a fortification, and the tail leading down from the castle was a natural area for building a town. I say perhaps because the archaeological digs of the 1990s have discovered mainly Iron Age dwellings from around 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, consisting of some sort of hill fort, similar to the ones found on other high points nearby, such as Arthur Seat. So, in short, the Castle Hill has been used for some sort of defensive structure for a very long time, and in most societies from medieval times, it was not uncommon for communities to prefer higher ground for their fortifications, and that was to protect their people, as well as giving themselves a good view of the surrounding area as an early warning system of advancing enemies. In the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, there are some signs of Roman occupation, but this did not last long, as the Romans had to leave Britain and return home to defend their empire. There are records of the early Middle Ages around 600 AD, a number of Pictish tribes occupying the area called Dun Eden, or the Fortress of Eden, and that is where Edinburgh, or Edinburgh, gets its present name. What I'd like to do is bring you up to the point where Edinburgh Castle becomes one of the most significant centres of royal power, and that was during the reign of Malcolm III in the 11th century. But it was his youngest son, King David I, who ruled from 1124 to 1153, who established Edinburgh as a seat of royal power, and he introduced extraordinary administrative reforms that would change the face of Scotland, including the establishment of an assembly of nobles and churchmen, which was a precursor to the Parliament of Scotland. At that time, the castle or fort would have been made from timber, except for 2 stone buildings, one of which is St Margaret's Chapel, built right at the summit of the rock and dedicated to David's mother, Queen Margaret, or as she became known, Saint Margaret. Incredibly, that building still stands today, and we will be visiting it on our tour. So with that bit of history behind us, let me start our journey from the Esplanade, right in front of this glorious fortification and facing the entry, with a drawbridge crossing over the dry moat to the large imposing wooden doors leading into the castle. The first thing you notice on crossing the bridge is that this entire section of walled gatehouse appears to be quite modern, and it is. It was built in 1888 and was added to give the castle a grander, more opulent look as you approached. On the left-hand side of the doorway is a statue of Robert the Bruce, probably Scotland's greatest king, who defeated the English at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, and he secured Scotland's place in history after the Wars of Independence. On the right hand is a statue of William Wallace, and I'm sure everyone, regardless of your Scottish history knowledge, will know this name from the epic film Braveheart, where his dying words rang out, "Freedom!" Above the doorway is a heraldic crest with a red rampant lion, the symbol of Scotland, and below the crest is the Scotland motto, Nemo me impune lacessit, which means, no one provokes me with impunity. As you walk through the entrance of the gatehouse, look up and you'll see a 17th century carving featuring Mons Meg, a huge cannon that we'll visit when we get to the top of the castle. When you come through the other side into the inner barrier, the sight of the sheer rock face upon which the castle is built is quite overpowering. Look up and you can see the stone from some of the earliest constructions perched on the castle rock, giving amazingly strong foundations to the buildings above. On these foundations stand the impressive half-moon battery, right above your head, and they were built just after a siege which ended in 1573. In fact, where you're standing would have been a very dangerous place in 1573 because the castle was being bombarded by cannon to try to force Sir William Kirkcaldy of Grange to surrender the castle to the king's men. This was the end of the Lang siege, and the Scots word Lang means long, and this was most certainly a long siege lasting from 1571 to 1573. This was not just a monumental moment in the castle history, but also that of the reigning monarch. In short, Mary Queen of Scots had been forced to abdicate her crown in 1567 and eventually fled to England, and she left her young son being crowned King of Scotland under the care or regency of the Earl of Murray. This actually split Scotland with supporters of Mary and the young king at each other's throats. Sir William Kirkcaldy of Grange supported Mary and held the castle in her name, hoping that she would make a glorious return. But after fleeing to England, Mary was effectively imprisoned by Queen Elizabeth I and would never see Scotland again. The siege was eventually successful with the destruction of much of the castle, and Sir William was forced to surrender. Most of the garrison was allowed to go free, but Sir William was totally humiliated, dragged behind a cart through the streets of Edinburgh to the Market Cross, down the Royal Mile, and was executed. And his severed head was placed on a spike on the castle walls. Interestingly enough, in my last podcast we visited John Knox's house, and I mentioned a man called James Mossman, and there's a plaque on the outside of the house. He was a goldsmith and known to provide jewellery to Mary Queen of Scots. Well, unfortunately, his support for Mary caught up with him, because he was with Sir William in the castle and was minting coins with Mary's head in them. For this treason, well, in the eyes of the king's men, he was also executed after the siege. Well, we're now going to continue up the hill on the narrow cobblestone road, and you soon come to the Portcullis Gate, a 16th century fortification built by James Douglas, Earl of Morton. If you look above, it's the Earl Morton's armorial insignia on the stone panel, which is decorated with hearts and stars. And there's also another red rampant lion representing Scotland, and this was placed here in about 1887 when the castle underwent some renovation. When the Portcullis Gate was built, it would have been the principal entry to the castle, with 4 strong barriers, the portcullis and 3 pairs of huge wooden doors. and you can still see the old portcullis above you with spikes pointing down dangerously as you walk through the gate, and if you look on the walls you can see the metal hinges upon which the doors would have been hung. Continue on up the slope from this gate on the cobbled roadway, and the space opens up with a set of cannons on your right-hand side and a set of steep steps on your left. The steps are known as the Lang Stairs, and as I've already mentioned, Lang is a Scottish word for long, and these are certainly a long, steep flight of 70 steps up to the top. This was the original access to the upper castle until, in the 17th century, a cobbled road, which we will take shortly, was built to make it easier for the movement of heavy guns around the castle. I referred earlier to the castle being breached once by attackers scaling up the north side to gain access to the castle. Well, if you look up on the curved wall to your right, you'll see a plaque which commemorates in 1313 the successful assault by Sir Thomas Randolph, Earl of Murray, during the Wars of Independence with England. This appears to be a wee typing error because it was actually on the 14th of March 1314 that Thomas Randolph defied all odds by scaling the walls and entering the castle. England had garrisoned the main castles of Scotland with English troops, and Robert the Bruce had tried but failed to diplomatically pressure Edward II of England to recognise Scotland as an independent nation. So the Bruce resorted to guerrilla warfare, especially against the English garrisons, with a view to taking back Stirling and Edinburgh castles. And it was one of his trusty lieutenants, Thomas Randolph, who came up with a cunning, if not dangerous, plan, especially as there was a large English guard force inside. His main attacking force secretly approached the castle from the east side towards the main gate, the main entrance, while Randolph, with only 30 men, climbed the 260 feet rocky cliffs on the west side. He'd gained help from William Francis, who was the son of the former governor of the castle, and Francis used to climb down a hidden path on the rock face to visit his secret lover in the city below. It must have been a treacherous climb in darkness and in silence, with one false move sending any one of them to their deaths down the rocky face while alerting the castle guards inside. When they finally reached the top of the cliffs, Randolph and his men rushed over the castle walls, taking the garrison inside completely by surprise and fighting their way to the front of the castle to open the gate for the rest of Randolph's forces. After successfully taking the castle, it was burned to the ground to prevent it from falling into English hands again. The only building to be spared was the chapel of St Margaret that I mentioned earlier. Only 3 months later, Randolph would play a crucial role in the Scots' victory at the Battle of Bannockburn over Edward II's forces, delivering Stirling Castle this time into Scottish hands. We won't take the Lang Stairs to the top, and instead we'll walk up the cobbled road with the cannons on the right-hand side. This is the imposing Argyll Battery, and named after John Campbell, the second Duke of Argyll, whose victory over the Jacobites at Sheriffmuir in 1715 brought him to fame. The Dukes of Argyll are also the clan chiefs of the powerful Campbell clan and have their clan seat on the west coast at Inveraray Castle. It was due to the threat of the Jacobites, especially after the 1715 Rising, that most of the artillery defences and bastions on the north and west sides of the castle were built. There was an attempt to scale the castle walls by the Jacobite supporters, but it failed. It was General Wade, who I've mentioned in other podcasts as the great builder of military roads, who reported that the castle defences were inadequate. The Argyll battery that you see is a 6-gun battery completed in the 1730s and was in action during the Second Jacobite Rising of 1745 when Bonnie Prince Charlie took Edinburgh. He established himself at Holyrood Palace as he was unable to take the castle, which remained in the hands of the governor, General George Preston, and he refused to surrender. The Jacobites tried to blockade the castle, but Preston's response was to bombard Jacobite positions within the town. After several buildings had been demolished and 4 people killed, Charles called off the blockade. Anyway, he had bigger fish to fry as he marched south towards London in an attempt to take the British crown back for his exiled father, James VIII. The cannons you see today are not the original and date from around 1810, but they are impressive nevertheless, and you get a great view over Edinburgh's new town from this lofty position. As you walk on up the slope, just beyond the Argyll Battery, you have the Mills Mount Battery, and you'll be surprised to see a very modern gun in the place of where the old cannons would have been. This is a modern 105mm field gun, and has become known as the 1 o'clock gun, which is fired every day at 1 o'clock except Sundays, Good Friday and Christmas Day, and it does shake Edinburgh to its roots. This tradition started in 1861 and for very practical reasons. If you look over the wall down towards the new town, then scan right, you will see Carlton Hill in the distance. On top of Carlton Hill is the Nelson Monument, and it looks like an upside-down telescope. If you were to stand here at 1 o'clock, just as the gun was firing, you would see a white ball raised and dropped from a mast at the top of the Nelson Monument. Now, this tower is visible from the River Forth, where warships and merchant vessels, the sailing ships of old, would be anchored. For astronavigational purposes, the captain of a ship needs to have very precise time and will carry chronometers, which need to be updated to the second. Well, it was first used in 1854, and 7 years later was complemented by a sound signal from the castle to ensure that when there was fog and the ball was not visible, there would be a sound signal giving the ship's captains the correct time. As we move on, and just behind the 1 o'clock gun, is the Red Coat Cafe. And this used to be the cart shed, an 18th century building holding around 50 carts to bring provisions from the town to the large garrison in the castle. Continuing up and around the cobbled road, you will see a splendid Georgian residence on the right-hand side. This is the Governor's House. It was built in 1742 for the castle governor or keeper or captain of the castle, and he had overall command of the royal castle. Governors ceased to be appointed after 1876, the last of whom was Henry Dundas, the 3rd Viscount Melville. The office came into being again in 1936 as an honorary title for the senior army officer in Scotland. Today the role has split, with the Army General Officer in command of Scotland regiments and the Governor of the Castle appointed for ceremonial duties. The building now serves as a residence for the Governor and is also used as an officer's mess. When I was serving in HMS Edinburgh as the logistics officer, we formed an alliance with the Royal Scots, and I had the pleasure of dining in the officer's mess in the Governor's house. Just beyond the house is the new barracks, finished in 1799. This gives you some idea of the age of the surrounding buildings when we still call this the new barracks. This impressive building housed some 600 officers and men and replaced soldiers' accommodation in the original 15th century Great Hall, which we will see shortly. In this new barracks today, you will find the regimental headquarters of the Royal Regiment of Scotland and the regimental headquarters of the Royal Scots Dragoon Guards, as well as the Royal Scots Dragoon Guards Museum. In 1995, this museum was opened by the regiment's colonel, our late Queen Elizabeth II. Just across the road from the barracks, you will find the former Royal Scots Drill Hall, constructed in 1900, and that's now the Regimental Museum of the Royal Scots Regiment. Now, if you do visit, look out for a ship's bell with HMS Edinburgh written on it. This was presented to the regiment as a gift for our close association. We came to know them very well, and the regiment has a proud history dating from around 1633. It's also known as Pontius Pilate's bodyguard, and I've often wondered why. So I contacted Lieutenant Colonel David Jack, the Royal Scots Regimental Secretary, to find out. Good morning, David. How are you today?
I'm very well, thank you, John, and thank you for inviting me to join you on your podcast.
Absolutely delighted. I'm just doing this tour of Edinburgh Castle and so pleased to speak to a member of the Royal Scots, the Royal Regiment. And can you just tell me when you first joined the army and why did you choose the Royal Scots Regiment?
Well, I joined the army in 1983 and was commissioned in 1984 into the Royal Scots. I joined the regiment because it's the Regiment of Edinburgh, and because when I visited the battalion, the 1st Battalion, before I went to Sandhurst, I was very impressed with the standard of the soldiers, and it seemed to be a happy group of soldiers and officers, and one that I thought I could contribute to and fit in with.
Fantastic. You've obviously had a super career and indeed returned to Edinburgh now, still working with the Royal Scots.
Yes, I spent 22 years serving in the Royal Scots and then a further 13 years in the Royal Regiment of Scotland, the successor regiment. And now I am back in Edinburgh as the Regimental Secretary for the Royal Scots.
And your favourite appointment during that time?
Well, the highlights are obviously when on operations, but I think one particular assignment stands out, and that was in Western Canada, where I spent 2 years on the training area, where all the exercises used live ammunition.
Oh, blimey.
And it was both professionally and personally very fulfilling.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. I don't think we'd let a bunch of sailors loose with live ammunition, so I'm pleased I serve in ships in that case. David, can you just give me an idea as to your association or the regiment's association with the castle?
The regiment has had an association since about 1860, a formal association with the castle. More recently, the association has been, the Regimental Museum has been in part of the castle since 1960. Mm-hmm. And the regimental headquarters was in the castle from 1960 to 2006.
Yes. I mean, I enjoyed the association with the regiment when I was on board HMS Edinburgh. And there's actually a bell that we presented to the Royal Scots Regiment, which is sitting in the museum today. So it's always good when I visit the castle to pop in and see our little present to the Royal Scots.
Yes, that's it. That's in a section of the museum where we promote the affiliations that we had, not only with HMS Edinburgh, but other regiments such as 10th Princess Mary's Own Gurkha Rifles, the Canadian Scottish Regiment, and the Royal Newfoundland Regiment. Mm-hmm. And we're very proud of all those affiliations that we've established over the years.
Yes. Am I right in thinking that the Royal Scots is the most senior regiment?
The Royal Scots was the most senior line infantry regiment in the army until 2006, when it merged into the Royal Regiment of Scotland.
Okay, wow. I mean, when was the regiment first raised then?
The regiment was raised in 1633 under the authority of a royal warrant signed by King Charles I on the 28th of March 1633, authorising Sir John Hebburn to raise a regiment, initially for service overseas, but ultimately for service of Crown and country.
Thank you, David. The Royal Scots clearly have a long and distinguished history. So, I understand that the Royal Scots are known as Pontius Pilate's bodyguard, and he was the man who ordered Jesus' crucifixion. I also know that the French regiment of Picardy claimed to have guarded the tomb of Jesus, or the sepulchre. I just wonder how the Royal Scots got the nickname.
This dates from the early years where the regiment was serving in France, initially for King Louis XIII of France. And as legend has it, there was a dispute with the regiment of Picardy as to who took precedence on the right of the line.
Okay.
And the regiment of Picardy said that to substantiate their claims as a senior regiment had been guarding Jesus' tomb, to which the Royal Scots allegedly replied, well, if we'd been guarding the tomb, Jesus would not have left it, but we were busy guarding Pontius Pilate.
I see. Well, what a lovely piece of regimental history. Thank you for explaining that, David. And finally, with the amalgamation of the Scottish regiments in 2006, where does that leave the Royal Scots?
Well, the regiment no longer exists as a serving regiment in the British Army. That ceased in 2006. The 6 serving Scottish infantry regiments were merged to form the Royal Regiment of Scotland, which is our successor regiment, and it's a sole infantry regiment within Scotland. However, we still run regimental activities. We maintain an association for all of our veterans and their families. We maintain and promote our history and heritage through the museum and, of course, the Royal Scots Club, which is based in Abercrombie Place.
And indeed, I look forward to joining you there in November at the regimental dinner, and I'm very much looking forward to that gathering.
That will be a real opportunity to continue our relationship with officers from HMS Edinburgh, and I'm looking forward to renewing some acquaintances.
Fabulous. Indeed, and me too, David. That's super. Well, David, thank you very much indeed for coming on the podcast today, the Unique Scotland podcast.
Not at all. You're very welcome, John.
Bye for now.
Goodbye.
And that was Lieutenant Colonel David Jack, the Royal Scots Regimental Secretary, who kindly shared his thoughts with us today. And if you want to know more about the Royal Scots Regiment, then please visit their excellent website, www.theroyalscots.co.uk. Now, continuing our tour of the castle, just before going up the hill into the body of the ancient castle, walk down the hill to visit the old prisons. They're built under the vaulted areas of Crown Square. These prisons were used to house prisoners of war, and in the 18th and 19th centuries, hundreds of men were held in these dark, cramped spaces. You can get a real feel for the conditions, as some of the spaces have been recreated to show what life would have been like in the late 1700s. The first prisoners arrive in 1758. French privateers caught soon after the 7 Years' War began, and that was the global conflict fought between 1754 and the early 1760s. The youngest person to be held was a 5-year-old drummer boy captured at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. Prisoners came from many countries, including Spain, France, Italy, Denmark, and even America, where they were fighting the American War of Independence. As it happens, an early depiction of the Stars and Stripes flag is scratched into a door within the prison. There were a number of attempts to escape, but the most tragic must have been the man who hid in a horse's dung barrow in the hope of being taken out of the castle to freedom, albeit smelly freedom. Unfortunately for this individual, the dung barrow did not, as he'd hoped, leave the castle to dump its waste. Instead, it deposited its disgusting contents over the castle wall. The poor prisoner was tipped out of the barrow with the contents, and he was dashed to pieces on the craggy rocks as he fell to his death. There are many more stories, but it's time to get back on the main cobbled road and ascend once more, leaving the Royal Scots Museum on your right-hand side and head up to a 17th century archway with the inscription Foog's Gate. Now, there's no record of who Foog was, or even if it was a person, so sadly, no explanation can be given. It used to be known as the Foggy Gate, and that was due to the fog that often engulfed the castle from the North Sea haar, or mist, that used to arise. Go through this archway and you're now in the upper ward of the citadel of the castle. Straight ahead is a small building up on the left, sitting on a rocky perch, and this is St Margaret's Chapel. And it was built by King David I in honour of his mother. We'll come back to this lovely building, but notice the large structures either side of the gate that you've just gone through. These were the large water cisterns built to reduce the castle's dependency on water from the wells. To the far left is the 19th century building, which was a former fire station, but it's now used as a shop. OK, having clocked these buildings, you should now turn right towards the Scottish National War Museum, or the back of it, and you'll come to a narrow gap to take you into Crown Square, the most prestigious part of the castle, and only accessible in the past anyway to His or Her Majesty and the most important courtiers. Immediately on the right is the Queen Anne building, which used to be a royal gun house, but was replaced in the early 1700s as rooms for staff officers and castle gunners. It was reopened in 1923 as the Scottish Naval and Military Museum, but these have now found new homes. Today the building houses a cafe and a function suite, and I love to pop in and take a cream tea there when I'm visiting the castle. When you stand with your back to the Queen Anne building, you have three other prominent buildings on this square. Directly opposite is the Royal Palace. To the right is the Great Hall, and to the left is the Scottish National War Memorial. Taking the Memorial building first, this site has an interesting history where the 14th century St Mary's Church used to stand. Now, James V redeveloped Holyrood Palace in the 1530s, and St Mary's Church was converted to a munitions store. This was demolished in 1754, and a soldiers' barracks block was built in its place. With the building of the new barracks that we saw earlier, the battalion moved out, and the building was converted into the Scottish National War Memorial to commemorate the dead of the First World War. It was designed by the famous architect Sir Robert Lorimer, who was responsible for many fabulous country houses in the early 1900s. He was also the architect for the extraordinary Thistle Chapel attached to St Giles Cathedral. Sadly, this place of memory for the First World War dead soon became a memorial to the fallen of the Second World War as well, and is still the place where servicemen and women are remembered in more modern wars. Unfortunately, man's inhumanity to man will undoubtedly ensure that many more names will be added to the books in this war memorial in the future. The building itself does do justice to those who paid the ultimate sacrifice, with sculptures symbolising a just war emblazoned on its exterior. Human figures on the Crown Square elevation signify courage, peace and justice, and right above the entrance is the figure of a phoenix rising from the ashes, representing the survival of the spirit. The inside is quite beautiful and has to be visited to really appreciate the design, with bronze friezes and amazing stained glass windows. My favourite place is straight ahead as you enter the doors, where you find a shrine with a metal casket on top. Inside is a roll of the honour of the Scottish dead of the First World War, or the Great War, or strangely enough, the war to end all wars. If only. Interestingly, the metal cask holding the roll of honour is made from molten down bayonets from soldiers' rifles. Leaving the museum, cross over the square and directly ahead is the Great Hall. Now, no castle was a castle without a Great Hall. It was the social and administrative hub of the castle, and this is where business was done and banquets were held. It was almost always the grandest and most impressive room in a castle to showcase the inhabitants' wealth and power to visitors. This Great Hall is no exception. It was actually completed in 1511, and the medieval ceiling that you see is original and is one of the most important hammer beam ceilings in Britain. It's huge, and the stone corbels supporting the main wooden trusses are carved with Renaissance sculptures, the oldest surviving sculptures in Britain. Look closely, and you will see features such as Scottish thistles and English roses symbolising the connection of Scotland to England when James IV of Scotland, only 13 years of age at that stage, married Margaret Tudor, the daughter of Henry VII of England and sister to the notorious Henry VIII. James and Margaret had 6 children, one of whom became James V, who in turn had a daughter, Mary, Queen of Scots. And it was this Tudor blood that gave Mary her right to the English throne as well as the Scottish one. Well, that's another story for another day, and I will cover Mary, Queen of Scots in a separate podcast. You'll see on the corbels the initials IR4. The I represents J in Latin and stands for Jacobus Rex IV, or James IV. Sadly, James was killed 2 years after its opening at the Battle of Flodden. His heirs preferred to use the comfortable Holyrood Abbey rather than the windswept and chilly Castle Rock Great Hall, so it fell into disuse, until, that is, Oliver Cromwell captured the castle in 1650, and he transformed the Great Hall into a barracks block for his troops, and it remained in military use for the next 250 years. When the army moved out of the Great Hall in 1886, an Edinburgh architect called Hippolyte Blanc was tasked with transforming the Great Hall to its former glory. He introduced an impressive Gothic timber entrance with wooden panelling around the walls and a spectacular hooded fireplace to give this space the look of a medieval hall that it used to be. Today you'll also find suits of armour and weapons from that period. When you turn around and you leave the Great Hall, look up at the huge painting above the door. It's a painting by Richard Ansell in about 1850 of a soldier who fought at Waterloo for Wellington against Napoleon in 1815. It's a wonderful action painting of Ensign Ewart in his red soldier's uniform on a white charger with a flag and pole above his head and dead French soldiers close by as he fells the last of them to take their flag. The flagpole that he's captured has an eagle on the end. This painting depicts the capture of the battle flag of the French 45th Regiment at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. The eagle from the standard is on display in the Royal Scots Dragoon Guards Museum that we passed on the way up. And when you leave the castle later, look to your left and you will see a grey granite block on the esplanade. This marks his grave. And you can also have a drink in a pub called the Ensign Ewart just down the Royal Mile in the Lawn Market. On leaving the Great Hall, we turn right and see the pièce de résistance in front of us, the Royal Palace. It's an imposing building with 2 wings of 4 stories high and a tall 6-storey octagonal clock tower with crenellated top and a flagpole at its centre. Little remains of an original building from the early 1400s, but a later construction of 1450 to 60 still stands today. An extensive renovation took place around 1617 for the visit of James VI of Scotland, when state apartments for the King and Queen were built. Indeed, it was James's son Charles I, and that was the one beheaded by Cromwell, slept here in 1633 just before his Scottish coronation. On the ground floor, which is known as the Lake or Low Hall, the most important event in the palace's history took place in 1566 when Mary Queen of Scots gave birth to a son who would go on to become James VI of Scotland. You will see a gold plaque on the outside of the building with the date 1566 and some initials. This depicts the date of James VI's birth, and the initials are of Mary and her husband Henry, Lord Darnley. On the first floor is the Crown Room, which was built to house the crown jewels, or as they're known officially, the honours of Scotland. These consist of the crown, the sceptre and the sword of state. Of course, these honours were not required after 1603 when the crowns of England and Scotland were joined. Elizabeth I, the Queen of England, had died with no heir, and James VI of Scotland became James I of England. You may remember Elizabeth I was the queen who had James's mother, Mary Queen of Scots, beheaded. Funny old world. Anyway, at some stage, these Scottish crown jewels went missing just after the union of Scotland and England. In 1818, Sir Walter Scott was given permission to search the castle for the crown of Scotland and, breaking into a sealed room, now known as the Crown Room, and unlocking a chest within, he rediscovered the honours of Scotland, which were then put on public display and have remained so to this day. In addition to the Crown Room was the Stone of Scone, or Stone of Destiny, in 1996, when it was returned to Scotland after 700 years under the throne of England in Westminster Abbey. Edward first invaded Scotland in 1296, and noting that the Stone of Destiny was used at Scone near Perth to crown Scottish kings, he thought that if he stole it, then Scottish kings could no longer be officially crowned, and so he took it south to London. And there it stayed until devolution in Scotland, when the Stone of Destiny was returned to its rightful owner and has been on display at the castle ever since. However, a new museum has been opened in Perth, and its centrepiece is the Stone of Destiny, which has now been transferred to its final resting place only a few miles from where it was taken 700 years earlier, right next to Scone Palace. As you leave the palace, head out of Crown Square by the opposite corner that you came in, and you'll see another defensive line of cannons on the right-hand side. Continue up and you'll pass the stairwell leading down the Lang Stairs, but ahead of you is an incredibly huge 15th century cannon called Mons Meg. This cannon has to be seen to be believed. It is ginormous, and has a history that deserves a story in itself. I remember seeing the cannon for the first time as a young boy, and I was intrigued then by its size and bulk. The next time I recall thinking about the gun was when I was posted to Belgium as a logistics commander working in the European Union military staff in Brussels. I used to go down to Mons at the weekend to play golf, and I wondered if Mons Meg had any connection to the town. As it happens, it does, as it was made in the town. It was originally a gift to James II of Scotland from his niece's husband, Duke Philip of Burgundy, in 1457. Mons Meg weighs 6 tons, or 6,600 kilograms. It has a diameter of 20 inches, or just over 500 millimetres, 13 feet long, and that's 4 metres. It's made from 26 long staves of iron and held together with iron hoops to form one piece. The cannonballs that are fired from the gun are made from stone and weighed 386 pounds, or 175 kilograms. Its range was about 2 miles, and that's about 3.2 kilometres. Incredible. One of Mons Meg's first actions was at the siege of Roxburgh Castle in the Borders region in 1460, which was one of the last castles to be occupied by the English during the Anglo-Scottish Wars. Along with Berwick Castle, James II of Scotland laid siege to the towns and bombarded the castle over a number of days. Mons Meg was used, but, ironically, another smaller cannon exploded during the bombardment, not far from where James was standing, and he was killed by the shrapnel. It must have been quite a sight to see the cannon being moved, as it would take over 100 men to pull her at around 3 miles per day. The gun was last fired on the 14th of October 1681 in a birthday salute to James VII of Scotland. Sadly, her barrel burst and she was left in the castle near the present-day Redcoat Cafe until being taken down to the Tower of London in 1754 under the Disarming Act that demilitarised Scotland following the Jacobite Rebellion. Not surprisingly, it was that great Scottish romantic author, Sir Walter Scott, who led a campaign to have Mons Meg returned to Scotland. In 1829, he and the Society of Antiquaries were successful, and the famous cannon arrived by ship in Leith when it was escorted by a regiment of soldiers back to the castle. So as you stand beside this amazing medieval piece of artillery, have a thought to yourself of its extraordinary history. Interestingly enough, while serving in Brussels with the Royal Navy, I visited the beautiful Flemish town of Ghent and was amazed to see a similar gun on display in the marketplace. It appeared that 3 cannons of this size were founded at the same time, and this one in Ghent is also one of them. Its name is Doelgriet in Flemish, which actually translates into Mad Meg. And now to the wonderful little church sitting behind the cannon called St Margaret's Chapel. This is the oldest building, not just in the castle, but in Edinburgh. It's believed to have been built by David I of Scotland in honour of his mother, Queen Margaret, who later became Saint Margaret. Queen Margaret married Malcolm III of Scotland in 1070. She was known to be a very pious woman and was responsible for establishing a pilgrim's way from the south over the River Forth to Dunfermline and on to St Andrews. In Edinburgh, there's a Queen's Ferry Road, and this is attributed to her, as well as the ferry crossings at North and South Queensferry. Indeed, the latest bridge to be built a couple of years ago was named the Queen's Ferry Crossing in memory of that legacy. St Margaret died in Edinburgh Castle in 1093. It's believed from a broken heart, having just received the news that her husband, King Malcolm III, who was also called Canmore or Great King, was killed at the siege of Alnwick Castle. As an aside, I meet monthly with my sisters Margaret and Morag for lunch, and Alnwick's halfway between our respective homes. It's always intriguing to think that St Margaret's husband, King Malcolm, died here 1,000 years ago. So back to St Margaret's Chapel. In reality, it's a tiny rectangular building measuring only 16 feet or 4.8 metres long and 10 feet or 3 metres wide. The architecture is Romanesque with chevron mouldings decorating the archway. It's built with irregular stone or is a rubble build, design typical of the date of build around 1170. The walls are about 2 feet thick and it has a capacity of around 20 people and is still in use today for weddings and christenings. I've often heard said that fathers of the bride, who pay for the wedding, are very happy to hear that their daughters would like to get married in St Margaret's Chapel, and this keeps the number of guests to a minimum. The chapel was actually used up until the Scottish Reformation in 1560, when it was closed and used as a storeroom. It was not until the 18th century, when the antiquarian Sir Daniel Wilson realised the significance of the chapel as that of St Margaret's Church, that it was restored and can be enjoyed and used by all today. Before I leave the building, you will recall that I said how the castle was captured by Thomas Randolph on behalf of Robert the Bruce in 1314. The castle was burned to the ground, but thankfully this wee chapel was saved. On his deathbed, Robert the Bruce spoke of the chapel and set money aside for its repair and maintenance. Of course, many believe that King Robert was paying homage to places of worship after he killed his rival, the Red Coming, in a church in Ayr, for which he was excommunicated by the Pope. In any event, Robert went on to become king, and probably the greatest king that Scotland ever had. Well, folks, as we leave St Margaret's Chapel, that is the end of this tour of Edinburgh Castle, and I hope you've enjoyed stepping back in time from the past to the most recent history. I visited the castle last week and took some up-to-date photographs, so have a look on my Facebook page and website to see those. And to ensure you get notification of all my Unique Scotland podcasts, please go to my website, Exclusive Scottish Visits, on the podcast page and click on the email subscribe button to register. Or you may be listening to Unique Scotland on one of the many podcast channels such as Apple, Spotify or even YouTube. In any case, don't forget to subscribe to hear much more of this amazing country. As always, I have thoroughly enjoyed bringing a part of Scotland to you, and I always welcome feedback, so if you wish to comment on any of the areas we visited today, or if you wish me to cover any aspect of Scottish life, then please do get in touch through the contact page on my website, or send an email to info@exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk. And thank you to Jack Taylor for getting in touch to say how much you enjoy my podcasts, and to Doree Giroux and Jason Klein from California. Delighted to hear you enjoyed the Clootie Dumpling Restaurant in Dunkeld, and thank you for listening. The next podcast is the final in the series of Edinburgh, and that's a deeper dive into the Royal Mile, where we'll walk all the way down from the castle to Holyrood Palace, looking into all the closes or alleyways to discover the famous people that occupy them and the history that was made in these dark and unwelcoming places. Well, I get a great deal of pleasure bringing you these podcasts, and I'm delighted to have met many of you who have listened to them. Some of you have come on tour with me, and others who cannot travel have sent lovely messages of support for allowing them to enjoy Scotland from their armchair at home. There's another group who have listened to my podcast and come to Scotland and decided to do their own thing, and also to try their hand at driving on the wrong side of the road. I'd like to remind you that I do provide a bespoke itinerary service with Zoom calls and personal backup, so get in touch if that interests you. Now, there are other podcasts to listen to, so do look at my back catalogue and see if there's something that tickles your fancy. I've also increased my YouTube presence with new videos of some of my tours, so go to YouTube and search for Exclusive Scottish Visits to watch those. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm actually putting up a video of Edinburgh Castle and the Stone of Destiny next week on YouTube, so look out for that. Well, it's been a pleasure to have you all listening today, and I'd now like to sign off in traditional Scottish fashion by raising my glass with a wee dram to you, wherever you are in the world. Slanjava.
You've been listening to the Unique Scotland podcast with exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk. To receive all our episodes automatically, please subscribe now.